Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Sauce Labs. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but before we get the ball rolling, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First of all, we are recording today's discussion. So if you'd like to review this at a later point in time, if you'd like to share with a friend, your team, you will be receiving a recording via email shortly after we conclude this live session. If you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options to do so. The first option is on the right side of your screen, and it says chat. So if you see that, go ahead and click chat, and then let us know from where in the world you are joining us. I already see we have Redmond and Texas, so I know we've got some wider breadth from that. If you do have any specific questions for us, though, we do want you to direct those questions to the Q&A tab. Sending those questions to the Q&A just helps us keep track, and we do want to be able to answer as many of your questions as we can today, so be sure to send them in. Now, if you stick around until the end of our program, we will be announcing 4 winners for a $25 Amazon gift card drawing, so be sure to see if you're one of our winners today. So our topic is test case scenario dives into CI/CD pipeline mastery. And I'm joined today by Jason Baum from Sauce Labs, who's going to be our host, as well as Nikolay Advolokin. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Jason at this point in time, who can introduce our full panel, introduce himself, and dive us right into CI/CD. Jason, you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, DevOps.com, Techstrong Learning, and everyone at Techstrong. And I am very happy to be here. Again, I am Jason Baum from Sauce Labs, and Test Case Scenario happens to be a podcast that we put out on a regular basis, where we come out weekly. And we cover a whole number of topics pertaining to continuous testing and more. And today we're going to dive deep into the heart of software development, specifically the intricacies of CI/CD pipelines. And, in this fast-paced tech world, understanding and mastering these pipelines is definitely paramount. So joining me today, as Cody said, is Nikolay Advolokin, our senior developer advocate, and Marcus Merrill, our VP of Technology Strategy. We are 3/4 of the test case scenario team. We are missing one, Evelyn, but look for her on other episodes. This is our first time doing it live, and we will be putting this out. And so we want this to be a collaborative experience. What we do is we normally pick a topic, and we just are a panel, and we talk. It's like being a fly on the wall for a conversation, except today you get to ask us questions as we're talking. And if you totally disagree with something, please pipe up. We love to just share thoughts, feelings, expressions, and talk it through. That's what this is all about. So as we move forward, we talk about CI/CD. I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. And that's, what is CI/CD and how does it work? And I'm going to throw that question to Marcus to start us off, and then we'll just do what we do.
Cool. See if I can keep this real short, because I have a feeling a lot of people know what it is, but I know that it's good to understand semantics and terms and understand the definitions that we're all going to agree on as we go through the talk. So as a tool set, CI/CD is a sort of a short form of saying continuous integration or continuous delivery. And I think, as will come out in this discussion, those are actually 2 separate things, but they're tied together by a common tool set, if that makes sense. What it allows you to do is to remove and automate all of the toil that used to go along with software deployment, and still does in some cases. I remember I worked for a company about 12 years ago where 50 developers were working on a team, and they would go work in their own separate branches. And then one person had an entire job, but from like Thursday to Friday, to merge all of the important commits in a release into the track, and then build the software, run the test, do all this stuff in order to make it to where they could do a release. Now, the job of CI/CD system is to choose whether you're doing continuous integration or continuous delivery, and then automate the entire process so that you're more or less able to release software regardless of the state of the tooling that has to touch the software along the way, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And we've done this. We didn't do this today, but we've done this in the past where I asked the question for someone to define something and we kind of put them in a phone booth. So Nikolay, forget what Marcus just said. And I'd love to hear your definition of, what CI/CD is and how does it work?
So CI/CD, as Marcus mentioned, this part is hard to forget. It stands for continuous integration and continuous delivery. To me, CI/CD is outside of a tool set. It's also a mindset. It's a mindset of releasing higher quality software faster on a more regular basis. And so the tool set that we put around in terms of like taking a piece of code, a feature you might think about, and introducing it into a pipeline where it gets automatically deployed, automatically tested, gives us some signal about the quality of the software. Sometimes the signal is enough, other times the signal is not enough, and we may need to do a little bit more exploration. But then ultimately the goal is to be able to, at the push of a button, decide whether we want to push a feature out to production and let our users test it or not. And so that's CI/CD. How it works is using a lot of these different tools that we have nowadays: GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps, Jenkins is one of the older ones, more legacy ones. Usually have a git commit or a git push that will enter the code into one of these tools like GitHub or Azure and so on. That tool will perform some actions. You define those actions. I think like some areas where I've seen you can start extremely like simple, and you can initially just have it run one test, or even just put out a message that compiles all of your code and validates that your code at least compiled. And now you have an automated compiling tool that can help you validate that everything is working. And then throughout the release pipeline, you can add different kinds of stages. You can organize the stages how you want. Some, like, I would say, good practices, things that people strive towards, engineering teams strive towards, is getting a faster feedback loop, right? The faster it is, usually the more valuable it is. And we also don't get bored and don't lose attention. And so usually you want to put tests that can give you a faster feedback earlier, and then tests that take a longer time later. And then hopefully through that entire pipeline, you feel comfortable enough that your software is great, at which point it can release automatically. That's the continuous deployment part. Or you might want to do a manual validation on it first, push a button, send it to production when you're comfortable.
Thank you, Nikolay. And, I'm so tempted to ask a question. Like, in theory, it makes a lot of sense. Does CI/CD work? Like, are we truly delivering faster?
Yeah, in my opinion, I mean, I've seen it work. I've seen it work in my previous two or three previous jobs. And it really does, as Nikolay said, it transcends the tool that you've chosen. The tool that you've chosen needs to fit the strategy and context of where you are. And we might want to talk about how to choose the right tool at some point.
Yeah.
But it absolutely, so it is what allows. So there's a legend in the industry. I don't know if it's true. I'd love if someone from Amazon is here to pipe up. Amazon ships changes to their software like every 8 to 12 seconds. Now, that's different teams across the world, but they would not be able to do anything like that if there weren't like a pipeline that is constantly evaluating and deciding on checkpoints and figuring out whether or not a feature is ready to move through and release and do those kinds of releases. That's continuous delivery. So it definitely works. I've seen it work. It's transformational to a company when they get it right.
When I've talked about this topic in the past, I think one of the areas, or even talking to you guys, somewhere where people get hung up is the initial setup phase, right? I think it's very daunting to automate things. Nikolay, you just talked about it a little bit, like trying to do something small. But what are the other common pitfalls that teams might face when setting up CI/CD pipelines, and how can they avoid them, and how can you make them feel a little bit better about getting started?
Yeah, sure. By the way, totally agree with Marcus. It 100% works. This is like one thing that I've seen work over and over. Some common pitfalls is, I think this is like a very common pattern in the software development industry, is start as simple as possible. Don't overcomplicate the solution that you're trying to create. And with CI/CD, to get started, as soon as you have like the code that you want to commit and it's hooked up into a version control system like Git, you can create a pipeline. It could literally be just triggered by you pushing a commit, and the pipeline can run, and whatever programming language you're using. If you're using Java, you can just do a Maven install. If you're using a Maven build, if you're using JavaScript, you can do a npm install and just compile your code. That's step one. Congratulations. You now have an automated tool that's compiling your code and telling you that things are working. I would say another pitfall is, after that, starting as early as possible. So once you have that, I would add one simple test. Like as soon as you have a little bit of code, one simple test, and have that running. And then the third piece of that, which is very important, is being serious about fixing your pipeline when it fails. If it fails and you tackle the failures as soon as possible, yourself and the team will have confidence in the pipeline and the results it brings. If you stop caring about your CI pipeline and let the failures linger over a period of time, people lose trust in that pipeline. And that is one of the worst things that can happen, because now the tooling is not serving the purpose that it was meant to do.
Yeah, plus one on that. I've seen, and I've been part of projects where there are, multiple hundreds of, say, automated tests where the manager comes in and says, "Oh, these are all these test failures. What's going on?" And you say, "Oh, don't worry about the failures. We shipped anyway. It's not a gate." And I'm like, well, that's where I learned the hard way that if you have a bunch of failing tests and they don't actually gate your release from going out, your automated tests are not actually contributing value to your pipeline at all, because you just obviously don't care. So plus one on that. That's a pitfall.
We just Sauce Labs just put out a report on game development, and a crazy amount. I don't know the number off the top of my head, so I'm not going to pretend that I do, but a large margin of games that are coming out incredibly buggy, and it was because of the need to push to production, need to push and get them out, and the backlash against these game developers. I mean, they're being cyber bullied because of the amount of errors that have come up.
Yeah, I was actually actively playing one game that was so plagued by that kind of a thing that the game effectively died just 6 months after it was launched, and it was a big release, AAA title. So I wonder if the chat could guess what I'm talking about. It could be one of a number of titles that have come out.
There's so many it applies to. That's I'll name one. I mean, it can take down franchises, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, the Madden franchise has been around since the early 90s, right? Or mid 90s. So it's one that I used to buy every version, right? Every one that would come out every single year. And over the past few years, it's been incredibly buggy, notoriously so. And I think it's definitely impacted that franchise.
I think companies get into this situation where they're like, oh, well, it's not like the old days where you ship a CD and then you're locked in time forever. And now there's over-the-air updates. You could ship incomplete software. You could just patch it in real time, patch it in production, no problem. Yeah. It's interesting also. So go ahead.
You go ahead, Marcus. I'll touch you.
I was about to pivot a little bit to talking about the pitfall of sort of dismissing CI/CD as maybe a buzzword or a fad, or like maybe we don't actually need this. And one thing I want to tell you that maybe hasn't occurred to everyone here is that CI/CD, when done right, solves the problem of it works on my machine. Because if you're a developer and you're working on software and the thing works, you might have some library, some .so file, some DLL, something on your local machine that you don't really know about, or some version of a file that you forgot to save, something like that. And the software consistently works on your machine, but when you share a build with a QA team or whatever in the test environment, it doesn't work there. When you put something into CI/CD, it is, I mean, if you're doing it right, it is by definition kind of an ephemeral existence, which means it came into existence with nothing but what it was told to have, because config is code, and we can go into that. And then it gets deployed in a way where there's nothing about your machine's context that was ever inherited. So there's no way it works on my machine is still valid. It eliminates that problem. And that is such a plague. I mean, I have a feeling a lot of folks in the audience are kind of nodding because they know how prevalent it works on my machine has been in the past. So I mean, that's one pitfall is of not adopting it.
What?
Yeah, Marcus, it works on my machine thing. That like, it's so interesting, and it made me think of like such a common example where I was helping a customer set up a CI/CD pipeline, and I'm on a Mac, and we set up a CI/CD pipeline that was running tests. They try to pull down the code and run the test, and it didn't work because they're on a Windows. It's as basic as that. And because on the Windows, you had to escape certain characters, certain quotes for it to work on Windows. And so that right there, like, then we introduced a step in our CI/CD pipeline to run on Mac and on Windows. And now we know that our software is working for everybody. And then the other point, Marcus, I wanted to touch on that I think you made was great was CI/CD is very interesting because if you have it, it gives you a sense of confidence and relaxation that things are going well. But there's a potential danger in that if it's not operating as it should, meaning like it's actually running tests that are doing valuable things, you can have a false sense of confidence. And so maybe that's what these game developers are doing and saying, hey, we have CI/CD, we have bugs, we'll fix them quickly. But their CI/CD is not really working as designed. And so they might be fixing stuff quickly, but also introducing regressions just as quickly. And so maybe their applications are actually degrading in quality over time.
It's possible. And now there's interesting, an offshoot of that is, and let me ask you if you've seen this before. In my experience, in industry experience and talking to customers, performance testing, load testing is not a part of this typical CI/CD pipeline. And load and performance testing is typically where I see AAA titles fall over in the multiplayer category. Does that resonate with you, Nikolay, Jason?
It does resonate with me. Yeah. And I think my brother actually works for Walmart, and he's responsible for a lot of the load testing there. And they have a totally separate environment where they do that. And I think it makes sense because it takes so much time and compute resources. You don't want that to be a blocking.
And so I guess that's the interesting question is, are games falling over because performance testing is not part of a CI/CD gate? Or can they not get the budget and planning to get a strategic level production or test environment that can match production? Or can they just simply not simulate the traffic? I'm curious if anyone in the chat has an insight into whether or not maybe performance load testing should be considered as part of the CI/CD. I can see arguments for not doing it. I can see arguments for doing it.
Yeah, feel free to ask questions anytime. We'll take questions at the end, but please contribute, be part of the conversation.
Participant 111, very, very spot on with the whole laboratory point about the laboratory environment. Yeah.
And why don't you call that out?
I'm sorry. CI/CD pipeline is your laboratory. If you don't eliminate variability there, you can't know if your experiments, newly released code, were successful on their own merits or not. So absolutely spot on, helps contribute to that point about works on my machine.
Maybe this next question I was going to ask kind of fits here. But what are some key metrics like the team should monitor to make sure that their CI/CD pipelines are healthy?
I'm still trying to figure out what the best metrics are, but some things that I like to keep track of are like the pipeline pass rate, for example. And that one is, it seems a little random, but what it helps to avoid is, for example, we've seen at Sauce Labs, we've seen customers that run automated tests and have 50, 60% pass rates with tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of tests. And so if you do that calculation and you assume that every failure is a bug, customers are not having like 40,000, 10,000 bugs per execution of their, pipeline. And so I like to see like a really high, like 99% pass rate. That tells me that our code is quality, that our tests are quality. I like to see the pipeline to be really fast. I like to see like a test suite for me personally, and 10 minutes max for a test suite, maybe 15 minutes if it has good reasons. For an entire build, maybe up to 20 minutes if it's a really large code base. But there are always ways to break it up and run things in parallel, run things on multiple VMs to make that faster. Beside the build pipeline pass rate, I like to see also a test pass rate. Also keep that high at like 99%. You got any, Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and I really want to try, and I want to try to move people to the point where the 100% is, is the normal. So what then do we measure? Like once we've cleaned our house, I think to me the first thing is speed, and speed is a good metric, not just because whatever you're shipping code faster. It's really about, to me, it's about the attention span of a developer. When I make a feature, I want to get feedback on that feature before I have time to get distracted by some shiny thing. I want minutes, and minutes can even be too long. So really, what I think we can aspire to in some ways, build some local tooling that's kind of a small version of this, and then when you commit, then you get that feedback loop fast enough that quickly whether or not you got something wrong. And that could come in the form of contract testing for APIs, or if you push a change to how an endpoint implementation operates, you didn't break the contract with the API that you're presenting to another team. But the big one that I feel like is starting to emerge as a primary metric is cycle time. The amount of time between a developer essentially taking a ticket and then that ticket making it into production. I might even have that a little bit wrong. It might be between taking a ticket and starting work and then getting it into the pipeline. But decreasing that cycle time so that you can really, like, that to me is the nicest kernel of productivity you can use to measure a team. I don't want to go all the way to like evaluating a person's performance based on something like that. I just think that it's an indicator. I wouldn't use that as an evaluation criteria for a person, but an indicator of the team's overall strategy and tooling success implementation. I don't know. That's kind of a weird way to put it, but cycle time I hear about all the time.
Hey, Marcus, can I throw on another one? You talked about cycle time. It made me remember about a really fantastic book called Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren. Yeah, she's fantastic. They did a bunch of like data-driven research on how high-performing development teams behave and their metrics and so on. Yeah, with Gene Kim, exactly. And another one they had in there was mean time to resolution. That's a good one as well, as right when your system goes down, how quickly can you bring it back up?
Yeah.
Yeah, seeing some great feedback there in the chat. Were you going to read something, Marcus?
I was going to read the question from 111. Do folks measure or at least try to keep an eye on flaky tests? Bad signals can be as bad or worse than no signal and can really put mistrust in the automated pipelines. I'm going to +1 that before I throw it over to Nikolay. Bad, flaky, brittle tests. So the difference between flaky and brittle means that flaky, you don't know if it's going to pass or fail. Brittle, once it's easy to break, and once it's broken, it stays broken. If you are not keeping an eye on that, I'm going to say that it says, is this bad or worse than no signal? I'm going to say it's absolutely worse than no signal, because if you have a test case that measures that tests, I'm going to measure something about the cart checkout flow, that when a user is dialing in from New Zealand, that they can get a similar SLA of experience. If that test fails or it's flaky and you ignore that, what you have done is represent to the business that you have a piece of feature coverage that in fact you don't have. So you're misrepresenting, or some might call that lying, about the amount of test coverage that you have and the risk coverage that your team is putting effort into. So not paying attention to flaky tests is just, you should delete those tests, because it would be better in the end if you just don't have metrics than if you represent that you do, but you're lying.
A reaction to that from participant 111 was oopsies.
Yeah,
I have committed this sin before, by the way. I've done it.
I think we all have. That's why we're like here preaching about this, is don't make the same mistakes as us. And that's what I like about using build pipeline pass rate and test pass rate as a forcing function to avoid flaky tests. If it starts getting too low, you know that something weird is happening and you want to get in there and investigate. And actually, on a podcast I run, I had Simon Stewart on from the creator of Selenium WebDriver. He talked about how at Facebook, what they do for flaky tests is whenever they commit code, they have systems in the background that will run these tests like a lot of times overnight to ensure that they're not flaky. And then only when those tests pass all of those iterations, they get merged into the code base. And then he talked about if a test fails, it automatically gets assigned to a developer to fix. If the developer doesn't fix within, I think he said a few months, the code automatically gets deleted from the code base. Because if you're not going to fix the test within a few months, you don't care about it. And so you don't want to be putting the business in this situation that Marcus talked about.
Yeah, why are you running a test that you don't care about? We actually talked about that on this podcast. And Marcus said that's not testing. Let's talk about tools. Everybody loves to talk about tools, right? Marcus, you brought it up earlier, said we were going to come back to it. Let's come back to it. What tools do you recommend? And I'll throw it to Marcus since you brought it up, Marcus.
So, sure. I mean, context is everything, and I wouldn't just, I wouldn't just choose a tool based on hype or anything like that. I would choose it based on the context, and I would try to steer away from choosing a tool that you used in the past just because it worked in the past. If you have gone to like a different industry or a completely different tech stack, so if I'm going from an e-commerce website to an app producing like a game company, I'm not going to use something like TeamCity. I'm going to use something like Bitrise. Like I would choose something that's based on the thing, but also, so first you got to consider budget. After you've made your strategy and after you know what you want, I would consider budget. I would consider how much handholding do we need? Can we host it ourselves? Should somebody else host it? How much time? So if I use a product like TeamCity, that's the one I'm the most familiar with. I love it. I think it's an amazing tool, but it's expensive and it requires a certain amount of knowledge about TeamCity. You have to learn about how to use TeamCity in order to use TeamCity, as opposed to learning a skill which is more transferable to another tool. Like if you learn about Jenkins, you're probably going to be really well suited to learn to use any CI/CD tool. Whereas the stuff you have to learn for TeamCity is in some ways kind of isolated to TeamCity. But the main thing I would choose as a baseline requirement is the ability to use build configuration as code that can be version controlled with everything else, so that when you make a change to your build config, there's an audit trail, there's a history, you can revert back to it. It's not just some change in a console that someone made that you have to go figure out how to undo it or something like that. So that was a big hodgepodge of stuff. I want to throw it over to Nikolay, see if he can bring it home.
Another thing I'd add, Marcus, is it's also important to consider what other teams and maybe what your organization's standard is as well. You know, one common pattern I see is some organizations will just become like, we are a C#.NET organization. And so they want to stay in that suite of tools. Is it the right decision? I don't know, but they made that decision. They want to stay within, right, that ecosystem. And so then probably for you as a team member trying to fit in and trying to avoid hurdles of writing business cases and doing security checks and so on, you probably want to stay within that tool set as well. While other organizations maybe not in the same area, and maybe you have a little bit more area to explore.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I feel like we've covered so much already. What advice, would you give to someone who's starting out and setting up their CI/CD and, maybe something that we haven't covered yet?
One thing I would definitely advise is this is going to be a little bit of a strange answer because it's kind of a prerequisite in my opinion. Learn Docker. Take 3 to 4 hours out of your day. Learn how to manage a Docker container. It's going to benefit your career in many, many, many ways. But if you start your CI/CD journey with Docker and the understanding of how to containerize code, it'll lay a foundation for just a smooth entry into the CI/CD conversation. Second thing I'd say is after you've learned Docker, Jenkins is like 2 command line things to get running on your machine. Doesn't cost a dime. So learn how to maintain. Docker has amazing tutorials on their site. Jenkins has amazing tutorials on its site. You can deploy a Dockerized version of Jenkins in minutes once you have a basic foundation for this kind of stuff. And then just try, as Nikolay said, the easiest thing possible, even if it means starting out with somebody else's GitHub repository. That's what I would advise, like that, how to get started. And maybe the advice is different. Maybe Nikolay can chime in for if you already have a project and you find yourself every Friday, it rotates between who's on duty to do the deployment. How does a team like that start to enter the CI/CD atmosphere? Is that something, Nikolay, you want to talk?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking, I'll build on what you said, and maybe I'll just take people through my ideal experience of setting up an entire CI/CD pipeline, knowing that the way I describe it as an old tech is not as easy as it seems. There will be twists and turns along the way that happen, but I'll talk about how I would approach it is, if you have a code base committed to some source code repository, let's say GitHub, right? And add a initial CI action that just compiles your code. Next step, I'd add a test that's easy to write, that's extremely stable, maybe making sure your website is up, maybe a API test, add that. Then I'd continue to little by little expand the different types of tests, always making sure that my pipeline is passing and stable and reliable, and everybody's always trusting its results. As it continues to grow, I'll probably encounter some speed difficulties. I'll start thinking about how to run things in parallel, how to run things on more VMs, maybe add more coverage, such as running on Mac and running on Windows, expanding it that way, and then getting to a place where I am really comfortable with all the automation coverage, all the CI coverage, where trying to get as close as possible to the code being able to run fully through the CI pipeline without me touching it. And all of that might take months, maybe a year, maybe more, all depending on where you are in your organization, the processes, and so on. But usually when I start a new project, that's how I try to approach it.
Nice. Thanks for taking us on that journey. By the way, everyone can tell that Nikolay also hosts a show and can take people on that. The way you framed how you were going to walk everybody through it, I thought was very
Opposed to my chaos.
Yeah.
No, that was, thank you. No,
yeah, that was just me ripping too. Marcus and not complimenting Nikolay.
Totally deserved.
So one thing that we haven't talked about is what's the difference in how to approach maybe mobile versus web or API?
Yeah. So I think that's interesting because I think of a spectrum between continuous and versioned software, and your business might have to make a big distinction between the two, because if you're an e-commerce company, you can ship changes every 8 to 10 seconds. You can do it continuously. A developer in Singapore can put code out. A developer in Seattle can put code out. It all goes to your web browser, and the web browser is constantly taking updates to how the app works. Mobile has to be iterative. You have to version a mobile app. It has to go through a review cycle on an app store. It has to be released in a very particular way with signing certificates and profiles and all sorts of stuff. And certain CI/CD systems are purpose-built for handling mobile. Certain ones, I think you have to use a plugin or have to pay extra or learn some extra skills in order to be able to figure out how to do that. But fundamentally, the way they operate is going to be different. You have to sort of make a decision point about whether or not you're going to push out a mobile release or a mobile update, as opposed to web. You just push constantly, and then turn off the feature flag if it broke or something like that. So the mindset is very different between mobile and web, and the way you set up your CD pipeline is going to be the same up to a point, and then at some point it diverges. So to a point, I guess I'd say you can build, run unit tests, run integration tests, run API integration tests, run functional tests, and that's about as far you can go with having the same kind of pipeline. After that, you're gonna say, all right, do all the signing, provisioning, all the stuff that I don't understand about how to release an Apple product, do all the stuff you have to do for an Android product, or just ship it to production because it's on the web and we can just always do everything. Does that make sense?
It does. Nikolay, anything to add there?
No, that was a fantastic description.
No, drop the mic. Oh, API? Did we talk about it?
Yeah, you want to talk about API? Or?
Yeah.
What was the question about API?
Like, just if there's
how
a
would you
difference
handle it
between...
maybe a little differently?
Oh, releasing an API?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think releasing an API is much different than what Marcus talked about in terms of web, right? I mean, your web app is going to have most likely some APIs behind that it uses. So instead of just towards the end of the pipeline, instead of having browser tests or visual tests or front-end performance tests or accessibility tests that you might want to execute on top of your browser for your web application, you're just stopping at that short of that point, and your tests are really like unit tests, integration tests, API tests, contract tests, maybe some security tests across the APIs as well. Yeah, and then the rest is pretty much all the same.
Great. I'm going to go to the chat now because, my gosh, we've got a question that has come in that I just absolutely love, and something that we talk about frequently. And the question is, like, what would be an ideal testing technique to implement, especially when developers aren't writing a lot of tests? I feel like, do we have another like hour and a half to talk about that question?
Yeah. Nikolay, you want to go?
An ideal testing technique.
I mean, I start with the pyramid, which is really a triangle.
Nikolay calls it a trophy.
A trophy, yeah, right. That's a really good way to put it. But in this case, I kind of get it. Like, I tend to, I think about sort of two things. One is that people. So, full disclosure, I'm on the Selenium Project Leadership Committee, and I've been using that tool for 15 years. It's kept me employed. But that said, people in this industry way overdo it with Selenium tests. Your Selenium test you should do enough Selenium testing to make sure that your front end is capable of rendering outputs from an API to a front end and still work for your users to provide a good experience. But I see constantly people iterating over and over and over and over on the user interface as though it were an API, testing business logic and workflows, which should be done through the API. So my testing technique would be offload as much API testing as you possibly can. That will be almost guaranteed to get developers involved, because API tests are 30 times faster and much, much more stable and reliable. And then they're also a lot easier to write, easier to evaluate what went wrong if something went wrong. And the other thing about API tests is just that you should really make sure that you are doing contract testing, because you owe it to the teams that depend on your API to guarantee that your contract is solid with them. That way you don't break anyone without, unexpectedly. You always understand how your API is working, and there's no surprises, no dark corners, as we like to say.
I have a different approach to this question. Totally agree with what Marcus said. You all will notice that Marcus and I will agree on a lot of things. We've worked with each other for many years.
You guys are agreeing way more than
I know.
normal, though. You guys,
I know. If you bring
We're not talking about blockchain.
Yeah.
If you bring up cryptocurrency or the value of software, Marcus and I will disagree, but pretty much everything else will agree. But to me, a question that pops out of an ideal testing technique when developers aren't writing a lot of tests is, why aren't developers writing a lot of tests? And for me, some reasons, why aren't developers even known to do testing in general? Some reasons jump into my mind from that. Number one is maybe there's a culture in the organization where activities are siloed. And so developers do developing and a QA team does the testing. And so it's a responsibility thing, right? Hey, that's not my responsibility. The QA team handles that. The other thing that can jump to my mind is maybe the developers don't care about the quality of the software and they just don't want to test. In my career, I've rarely ever seen that. All the developers I've ever worked with, they care so much about the code that they produce. And so then it kind of just falls to the last part, which is testing is hard. It's a new technique that you must learn. There are a lot of tools. There are many types of testing. And so I think a lot of developers just find it difficult. And so one of the best ways that I've seen this problem solved is make it the responsibility of the entire team to maintain the software. When it goes down and it's on the weekend, you got to wake up and fix it. If it's Friday night, 2 a.m., wake up and fix the software. And so now when the quality of the software becomes everyone's responsibility, developers will be very excited to figure out how to write automated tests and team up with you to make the software more stable and be maintained by a CI pipeline instead of them waking up in the middle of the night to figure out what went wrong.
There's a follow-up, I believe, to that question. And it is, what about distributed software when there might be hundreds, if not thousands of instances running collaboratively? How would you test that kind of use case or those use cases?
I'm still struggling to find the context. The only context where I've worked where we have hundreds, if not thousands of instances is a non-SaaS B2B type program where it gets installed. That is not what I think you're talking about, because those aren't running collaboratively. What I'm thinking about is something like a low-code testing solution where you have a platform and people are creating workflows and custom things out of it, like, for example, Salesforce. And I feel like, and I don't know if this is a complete answer because I have not worked in that kind of a company before, I feel like the answer is that API contracts are the only thing you can really super guarantee. If people are customizing and layering stuff on top of that, I think there's going to be some sort of contractual limit to your requirement to support what people are doing on their own. I wish I had a better answer on that because I'm not sure I know the environment well.
The person who asked the question just followed up with context blockchains nodes.
Oh, count me out.
Yeah, Marcus is going to abstain from answering that question.
I'm
with great disdain.
We can link to our episode where I basically talk about blockchain, and I don't want to go into it.
No, we probably shouldn't go into that today. But I do want to revisit something that Nikolay said about developers not caring about quality, because we've had debates about this, but like, how do you balance that need for speed that everybody talks about, right, versus ensuring software quality? I love it when I stump you both.
Was
that really a hard question?
I'm sorry, Jason. I was
It's-
typing
it's
an
the-
answer, and then I
No,
decided
he's not
to
paying attention.
abandon the answer.
Oh
I'm
my
really
God.
sorry. Just like
It's just
live
I'm
broadcast.
gonna throw
folks.
chalk at you. Do teachers still use chalk? I don't know.
No, it's dry erase markers. Now it's worse.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if those two things have to be mutually exclusive. Like, you don't have to sacrifice software quality for speed. Maybe in the beginning, yes, writing tests takes extra time in terms of pushing out more code. Sure. But what about all the time that it saves you in testing and fixing bugs? I don't have the analytics on that, but I can say that if you have a good suite of tests, maybe someone like Amazon, you can push out features to production every 10 seconds or whatever that is. While if you did not have all of that, you would not be able to do that. And so really, without the tests, how much lower would your quality be, and how much slower would you be releasing features? You would actually be slower in that case. And so I think it's like, I don't know, it's like a level of effort curve. It's like initially it's hard to get started, but then it drops off in terms of how easy, and then you just like coast and just add a little bit of tests here, a little bit of test there, and your software just works well and is fast.
What is the saying? Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. To me, if you stick to the right small number of tests that cover your highest risk areas, it allows you to start from a place where you always trust your builds. And then as you enhance them and add them, I think it's important to just not overdo it. I mean, I worked for a company a while back where we were very, very proud that we had something like 70,000 unit tests. And then we figured out that it's taking, 2 hours for the builds to run. This is a while back when CPU power wasn't as cheap as it is now. And at some point we decided to delete, very carefully, judiciously delete 80% of those unit tests. And we saw no drop off in quality. Now, there's a lot to that, and there's a lot of discussion to be had before you dive in on something like that, especially around unit tests. But I think that it is very, very possible to over test stuff to a point where the maintenance burden of keeping tests alive, especially if they're irrelevant, it just outweighs the benefit you're getting out of it.
Yeah, that goes back to what you were saying before, right? I mean, if it's not showing anything and you're not paying attention to it, you're not fixing it, why are you testing it?
So Titus, our colleague, has a thing he tells people all the time. They say, here's our smoke test suite, the tests we really care about, and then here's our nightly suite of all of the tests. And he basically says, you just stop running those. Just stop it right now. If they're not important enough to gate the release, then they're just not important enough. Now, that's not universal recommendation. That's just a thinking, it's an exercise you should go through to sort of, guide your strategy and your thinking. Marcus is not advocating deleting 80% of your tests.
There are so many great comments in the chat that one just replied to that comment, by the way. Testing debt is technical debt. I also want to read this quote that someone threw in there from Gene Kim, Phoenix Project, Unicorn Project. Everybody knows who Gene Kim is. The quality of the daily work is less important than the improvement in the quality of the daily work. Oh my gosh, that's such a great quote. And then someone else put, the organization is siloed as suggested by Nikolay. QA teams run tests and devs tend to not write lots of tests. So looking at long-term solution as to bridging the connection between the pipeline and the QA testing.
Can I touch on that real quickly?
Yes, please.
I recently just having like fantastic conversations with Jason, Marcus, and Evelyn through our Test Case Scenario podcast. I realized there is an extra responsibility if you choose to take on for automation engineers, that's maybe even DevOps professionals that know how to test and write code and set up CI pipelines. And that is, I feel we should be a bridge between the siloed QA teams and the siloed dev teams, because we understand both sides. We can write the code, interpret the code, and we understand the testing part. And so I think in these kind of situations, it's on us to communicate with both and serve both teams to ultimately unite them towards one purpose, where the QA team is comfortable with the automation, and the automation is showing them that the software is working as expected, and the dev team is seeing the fast iterations, the fast feedback loop. Their ability to release software gets faster because of the automated tests, and so they're happy. They get less bug reports from the manual testers, so they're happy, and now we've done a really good job.
Yeah, well said. I'm going to open it up to any other questions for the panel, or anything you would just want to say. We'll repeat it, and then you get to be, you get your air time.
Yeah, I mean, I just say for just to plus one a little bit on that. I think if you're looking to build a bridge, find the most, let's say 4 most reliable automated tests that protect your most important features from breakage, and just put them in the pipeline. And if they're that reliable, that solid, there's a good chance nobody will even notice they're in the pipeline. Maybe they'll notice. I don't know. It shouldn't slow things down too much, especially if you're running automated tests in parallel. But like one day it breaks and it actually finds a bug. Oh my gosh, you got so much credibility. It's a shocking transformational thing when suddenly, if that happens, then you start adding just a few more tests at a time. And I would say if you're at this point where there's so little communication between the two, don't ever overload with more than a few tests. But if those tests reveal actual breakages every time they fail, suddenly developers will, without even thinking about it, start caring about them and paying attention to them. I've seen it happen at least 3 different times. About tools, what do we use for API contracts? Earlier, somebody asked for a definition of contract testing, and I'm going to try to do this as quickly as I possibly can. When you, so to explain the concept of an API contract, I always talk about cars, automobiles, metaphors, things people can understand.
Marcus is the master of metaphors.
All right. Thank you for overselling.
No worries.
When you put a key into the ignition of your car, you have no involvement with what's going on after you turn the key to make the engine happen. There's a contract between you and the maker of your car that says, when I turn this key, the engine's coming on. I don't care how it happens. It's going to happen. An API contract is a similar thing where there's an expectation. We're going to define a set of functionalities that say, when you send this request to get a username based on this authentication token, we're going to send you back some amount of information in return that we guarantee you, if you send it in the right format, then we're going to send you back this information in this format, and it will be correct. And if I then change zip codes from being numeric, because we're now going to an international audience and we're accepting characters, and if I change that contract and it sort of breaks, or if I go the other way around, I stop accepting characters and go only to numeric, and it stops accepting those, then I've broken the contract. If I change how those parameters are taken in or given out. So I don't know how this works here, but for API contract testing, I'm a little bit biased to a tool called Sauce API testing, which actually does look at the contract that is publicly available for an API or microservice, and it generates a set of tests that will actually guarantee that contract stays in place throughout development, and it'll do regular testing to make sure that it stays in place. I think there are other tools on the market and even in open source that do that. I just don't have any in instant recaller. I promise I would say them.
Hey, Marcus, in the chat while you were talking, I dropped in 3 links because I interviewed 2 of the maybe world's leading experts in API testing, Mark Winteringham, who literally wrote a book on automated API testing, and Bas Dijkstra, who's just a sensationally smart guy. I'll drop those YouTube links into the chat so everyone can reference those episodes, and they expand a lot on what Marcus talked about and beyond.
Yeah, they're definitely more better than me, better sources than me.
Well, awesome. I think this is a great place to wrap it up. And first of all, I want to thank everybody who's in and listening and participating live. It was a lot of fun to do an episode of Test Case Scenario live for you. And thank you to Marcus and Nikolay, as always, for just downloading all of this information on us. And a special thank you to Techstrong Learning and DevOps.com for hosting us, and Sauce Labs for making sure this can happen. And thank you for another great episode of Test Case Scenario. We will see you next time.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Well, Jason, Nikolay, Marcus, thank you all so much for joining us here on Techstrong Learning. Before I let everyone go, I do have just a couple of things I do want to review. First off, I do want to remind everyone that we have been recording today's session. So you will be receiving an email with a link to access this recording on demand. Or of course, you can find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. And be sure to look in the on-demand section where it will be waiting for you. The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing, they are Daniel B., Shruti S., Jane T., and Judson C. No Jason Baum.
I was really hoping I could buy dinner.
Well, so to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox. We're going to reach out to you in the next 48 hours. But if you don't happen to see that email, check your spam folder on the off case that it happens to be filtered out. I'd like to thank Sauce Labs for sponsoring our program today. And to our audience, if you're still hearing my voice, thank you so much for being here. We do want you to stick around for just 1 second. As soon as I close out, there will be a survey that pops up, and we would love to hear your thoughts. So thank you once again for joining us, and we hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong Learning experience. Have a great rest of your day. And Jason, Nikolay, Marcus, thank you again.